Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Absip Women in Focus budget review. It is not definitely the kind of budget review that we all hoped for, but it's certainly one that will be remembered because for the very first time in the entire democratic dispensation, we've never had to cancel or postpone a budget speech. And so we were debating whether we should go ahead or not. And of course, as the famous saying that says, don't let a good crisis go to waste, we saw this as an opportunity for us to still talk about the crisis and unpack really what it is about. So my name is Thulebona Mhlanga, and I am an AWIF committee member. And with that said, I'd like to just welcome you to, of course, our flagship event with our national office, which is the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals. Who is AWIF? AWIF is a woman leg of Absip, and what we've essentially done over the years is impact over 200 women in the financial sector, and we've actually done so through a number of programs, impacting them through personal and professional development. So I do want to welcome you to this very august webinar, as it were. We are not necessarily in Cape Town, but we should feel like it. And this evening we are joined by two brains whom I believe we could not have had a better choice to actually take us through this conversation. I do want to introduce Mandisa Zavala, who is going to be our moderator this evening. And of course, she's joined by an Absip, brain that we pride ourselves in, Ndumiso Gubega, and we are proud to call both of them ours. And I just want to say you're in for a treat because both of them have illustrious careers, but not only that, they're very respected professionals within the industry. So you are in for a treat, and do feel free, the more the merrier. Questions that come into the chat, we will be monitoring that chat group throughout the webinar. We've got an hour and a half to ourselves, so let's engage. And of course, let's keep Mandisa company this evening. And with that said, without further ado, let me hand over to Mandisa and Ndumiso Gubega.
Thank you so much, Tule. Thank you, everyone that is joined in. I see Ndumiso there. Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely been an eventful afternoon filled with lots of memes that are already starting to fly around. If we had the time, I'd be interested to see what everyone's favorite meme is so far, or if you're creating a meme, I'd love to see what you're doing now. But yeah, definitely an afternoon we did not expect. I have the privilege, of course, of being joined by Ndumiso, who is an executive for over a decade, with over a decade of experience in areas like trade, investment promotion. He does facilitation and aftercare. He serves on several listed and unlisted boards and services multinational and domestic corporations in helping them navigate a complex economic and regulatory operating environment. Sure, yeah, I'm already intimidated. He holds an MBA from Gibbs. He's completed the Alternative Investment Program from Harvard Business School. He's got a BCom honors in economics from UNISA, and he's got a BCom in economics and international trade from NWU. And he's here today to help us, unpack what has essentially been happening in over this last couple of hours. I said to him, is there anything particular that you want me to ask rather than what the hell happened? So we sat and we figured out maybe there's a few questions we can come up with, to kind of unpack it. But I think essentially maybe that's where we can start from, Dumi. So you can just help us really figure out, we're here today. It's very different circumstances. Why does it look the way that it looks right now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mandisa, and I'm quite delighted to be having this conversation with you and, of course, all our colleagues who are joining us on the call. I think for all of us, this is certainly a reminder that we are in a government of national unity, which is the first, well, not necessarily the first of its kind in this nature, but in terms of shared power in the context of South Africa post the election outcomes. And so when there are not necessarily agreements or alignments when it comes to key policy decisions, I think this is something that we can anticipate in the near future. And I think today was just a reminder of that. What that means in terms of how we think about economic policy, what are the expectations and the outlook going into the future. I think it just requires, it just means that the level of debate and engagement around policy options becomes all the more heightened. And I think it also provides a platform for greater scrutiny around why we make the choices that we make. You and I guess, over the years have lamented, some of the opportunities that exist in the South African environment at an economic level, and of course from an investments perspective as well. And perhaps this is another platform and an opportunity to really make sure that we're able to have more meaningful policy options going forward. And I think perhaps today is just a reminder of that opportunity. I see you're on mute today.
Sorry, thank you for that. I was going to say, just to unpack in a bit more detail, and hoping you have as much detail as we can possibly provide us with, because it has been just a couple of hours. What the essential central debate was in terms of fiscal policy, which has actually led us to the postponement of this budget, as you call it, of this national government of national unity budget, essentially. Can you just paint that for us and what essentially?
So the central debate that led to today's postponement of the budget has been around the tax proposal for a 2% increase when it comes to valued added tax. And of course, that has guided the projections, the modeling, and the allocation of resources in respect of the budget that we have today. And of course, we have learned from what the minister and his team have shared. Some of this information was not necessarily widely spread or shared with members of cabinet because of considerations around market sensitivities and so forth. But ultimately, it then speaks to the idea around what then are the best policy options at a level of fiscal policy that South Africa has in this point in time. And one would even think that given the context that we find ourselves in, greater consideration and interrogation around what are South Africa's optimal tax rates, considering the Laffer curve, for example, in this kind of environment, and what are the policy options that we have in order to really get to a point where we're able to achieve a 3 and 5% GDP economic growth. And so those are really the central debates. And of course, given the policy options, the prevailing policy options that we have, do we, of course, borrow more debt? Do we cut expenditure in real terms? And of course, what do we then do to sort of drive the economy going forward in order to increase those tax revenues? And so those are some of the central debates related to fiscal policy that have led to what we've seen today.
So do we, putting you on the line here, but we have heard this back and forth around the 2% VAT, and is that, do you expect that perhaps the middle ground would be still an increase in VAT, but perhaps not as steep? Or I guess, given the gravity of disagreements, that we may actually even be in an environment where we don't even see a VAT increase and they have to find the revenue somewhere else.
So I'm not as persuaded around the usefulness of a VAT increase in the context of the state of where the South African economy is right now. So I'd be interested to hear what are some of the policy debates that are raised by colleagues at that level. But I'm not particularly persuaded to the extent that what is the extent to which certain increases when it comes to specific elements of our tax structures that either creates enhancements in terms of revenue collection or is actually destructive to the economy. And so I think the balance of those risks becomes quite important in order to really meaningfully consider those. And so I think the 2% VAT increase and the case for that, as drastic as it is, in my view, would need to be thoroughly interrogated as to whether or not it would create those enhancements or whether it would be sort of destructive to the economy. But I do think that there are some other options that can certainly be considered around how do we then this conversation around some of the leakages that we've seen in terms of the disbursements and their distribution and the utilization of resources is another central debate, I think, that will be one that is paid close attention to. And by this, I would make reference to the efficacy of government spending. I think that is an issue that will draw greater attention going forward, to the extent to which for every 1 million rand that we're spending in government or in a particular program, what is the gross value added that we get from that particular expenditure? And so I think that kind of debate is one that will be heightened in the context of what we've seen today.
Sure, very interesting points. Thank you for that. We've heard 12th of March is the date to look out for, but I have also seen some publications that are saying the postponement of the budget is indefinitely. And in listening to the post briefing update with the minister, the mics, they were very close to the mics. So we could hear certain things that I don't know. Yeah. And he said, someone mentioned 7th of March and he was asking, where's the 7th of March coming from? And then someone was like, but you said it. So like, what is happening? Oh, is 7th of March the date that's been officialized to say this is when we'll be receiving the budget? Is it up in the air at the moment? And if that is the case, what should we be expecting then on this 12th of March or 7th of March or whatever date that we're going to?
So I do think the 12th of March was also communicated in Parliament. So
Okay.
As official things go, I think we can take that date unless there are other developments and colleagues deliberate further around whether or not it makes sense. And I think in the lead up to that, we're likely to see further proposals around really the policy options that we have in respect to that. Because one of the key questions is to say, if the budget allocations today were based on the assumption that we would be able to get that 2% VAT increment and that it would be approved through the processes of Parliament and ultimately ratified by the President, what then is the trade-off that needs to be made if that is not going to proceed lead up to the 12th of March? And so that becomes a very difficult question to reach. And that's why I think the questions around the optimal sort of text structure for South Africa will become an important deep dive of focus for technocrats as to whether or not it makes sense. And ultimately, where have we seen leakages? And as well, I think departments and programs which have been underspending will also get greater attention, because consistently returning funds back to the National Treasury, that of course, from a planning point of view, certainly does suggest that the usage of those resources is not there. Or sometimes it's not necessarily the case. It's just a question of a lack of proper governance and implementation execution on important government programs. So I interpreted the lead up to the 12th of March, in my view, as an elevation of the debate around fiscal policy and its effectiveness. And I think it comes at an important time when we're trying to really find the solution or the ingredients to say, where will growth come from? Because ultimately that's the question that we want to answer. And so this, I think, is an important lead up to that. And I think an important time in South Africa's economic history to define whether or not we're able to, as you, I think, Tulebona mentioned earlier, making the best use of a crisis.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. If we move on to markets, just a reminder for those that are online, you can post your questions in the Q&A section. I don't see any questions there, but please post it, even if it's just a question on, Ndumisa's background looks great, by the way. I'd love to have it after this so that I can put it also on my background. Whatever you want to post, even if it's just an encouraging message to the economists, please say something. It's the Q&A section. I think Tapiwa has already posted a comment there, so you can either respond to him or just post a new question. Numiso, I want us to talk about, I think, the implications of what has happened on a two-part basis. Obviously my focus being on the side of asset allocation, I always focus on market reactions and what markets will do. So I'd love to understand from your side what you expect markets, how you expect markets to play out. We've already seen the Rand weaken on the back of this. So it's clear that I think from that perspective, sentiment is such that this is something that has, kind of rattled a couple of feathers. Whether that is persistent or not is obviously something we need to, we can, kind of unpack here. But also, what if there's any other developments, any other impacts, things like sentiment would come to mind. I don't want to lead you, but what do you expect will come from this? And I think even with that in the back of your mind, my last question is going to be around whether this postponement has been a good or bad thing. And I know we're probably going to be drawing a line, to say is it good or bad, but maybe even in your answering it, to try to give us an understanding of how you would view it, as opposed to, because I think it's been a shock because we've never had this before, but also it doesn't mean that because it's a shock, it's a bad thing. You kind of help us sort of interpret that. So again, just to, quickly summarize the question: impacts on markets from your perspective, impact on other things that we may not necessarily be aware of, and is this a good or bad thing, essentially?
I think it's so crucial, Mandisa, what you're highlighting, and particularly for markets. One of the greatest value where markets are concerned is the extent to which you are able to predict certainty in specific assumptions. And so I think in this instance, one of the reasons why we saw some of that weakening in the Rand, and of course, some of the movements that have taken, that took place in the bond markets, is particularly because this was, of course, unexpected. And of course, the associated uncertainty as to whether or not what is taking place as a result of this. Although there were rumors over the weekend around, new tax proposals and so forth, but nothing that we could concretely rely on. And that's never really a great thing. In economic terms, we like to refer that we don't necessarily like information asymmetries, particularly when it comes to. And so if we're communicating a particular message, it's important to communicate that message consistently, whether wrong or right. And I think markets are able to price in whatever risks that are associated with that particular position. And then we're able to ensure that, whatever foreseeable forecasts can then be priced in for. And I think it's also important, maybe, Mandisa, to also include the context around the international economy that South Africa is also located within, with the number of policy propositions that are taking place at the level of trade and discussions that are taking place. South Africa also being the host of the G20, so leading very important discussions around sustainability, and yet we're also faced with important trade and competition policy questions of our own, like many other countries around the world. We're also finding that as a developing economy on the southern tip of the African continent, we're also now facing similar challenges that advanced economies are facing. The likes of Germany just in 2024 also had budget delays as a result of lack of alignment in terms of economic policy considerations. You look at the Netherlands, who also had a similar budget announcement delay for them, in their case, related to allocations or budget cuts with respect to education and education programs. And so this is the context that we find ourselves in. And I think as markets are able to adapt to what is South Africa Inc. communicating in respect of fiscal policy and other policy sort of regimes in which they're communicating in this administration, the more the markets are able to sort of adapt and also price in the risk sort of factors that are important to them across asset classes. And so I think when we interpret the movements that we're seeing in the market, it should be viewed in that particular context. Is the message consistent? What are the surprises that we're seeing that ideally we should not be seeing? And I think the moment we're seeing surprises that we should not be seeing, then we should expect movements that would not necessarily be good in terms of the assets that we're looking at in the markets.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. It seems as though the key takeaway there is, this is not new. we are not, it's not unprecedented in the context of the global, context of other governments of national unity. And I think it's important for our viewers to also take note of that. It is new for South Africa because we also have a new government structure that we've never had before. But that it is perhaps also good in the way that it really is coming into effect, where it seems as though the multiple voices that we did want in the room based on voting, by the way, are essentially making the right noise, because essentially before we would have just gotten this, right? And now we actually do have a couple of voices that are, contesting and all of that. So you do want that debate. It seems as though that is what I'm taking, from what you're saying. There's an interesting question in the chat from Ukawe that is rightfully asking if this postponement is going to affect our tax season.
Well, I'm no Edward Kieswetter, but I would imagine that because it still falls within, the period within which budget announcements and all of the necessary sort of allocations needing to be made, I do not anticipate a material effect in terms of the tax calendar and so on and so forth. So I would not necessarily expect that, Kawe, although I'm not the commissioner.
Good point. Yeah, you have to make that that point on top of that. We do have another question from Faith. She says, "Good evening and thank you for the session. The DA MP made an interesting comment that the postponement was necessary to look out for the best interests of South Africans, especially the poor. Any thoughts on representation of the poor by political parties and politicians in and outside of the GNU?"
Sure, I think that's an interesting point. Perhaps one of the upsides and perhaps one of the reasons why the markets received the government of national unity in a positive light is, in economic terms, we would like to think that competition is generally good for the common good. To the extent that you have some level of competition within government structures, a plurality of views and policy positions, I would think that also elevates the discourse, even particularly on policy issues that affect the poorest people in South Africa. And so I think for me, when I interpret the upside of such an event and how we can actually make the best use of a crisis, is the extent to which these differing views are able to elevate policy positions that perhaps we have not considered well in the past. Sometimes when in policy making, there's a Prof. Carol Bachi, who is an expert in terms of public policy analysis. She typically makes the point around when putting forward policy propositions, what are some of the silent issues that are not being discussed? And I think this is an opportunity to really explore the silent issues that have not been discussed, whether it be in respect of how does our economy continue to support and improve the upward mobility of poor people in South Africa? How does the economy continue to be an attractive investment destination for investors both domestically and internationally, whether we're comparing ourselves with emerging economies or advanced economies? How does the economy provide the kind of sustainability theme that we speak of in the G20 that people would want to associate themselves with our economy 20, 30, 50 years from now? And so those are some of the issues that I think, in light of the sort of the events of political outcomes, that I think can be taken advantage of in order to ensure that we're able to have a prosperous South Africa going forward.
Great. There's two questions I want to combine together, just in the interest of time. The first one speaks to the kind of impact we will see on the division of revenue bill, and to what extent. And then the second one speaks about the VAT increase and how that will counteract the SARB's recent rate cut in terms of inflation and overall economic growth.
So the division of revenue bill is certainly impacted, particularly in terms of the allocation of resources across areas. Being reminded that this particular budget was drafted based on the assumption that a 2% VAT increase would be approved by Parliament and ratified by the President. So, failing which, that's where what we were discussing earlier around, in the event that we're unable to sort of get an approval of such a policy recommendation, what will then close the gap? Will it be borrowings or will it be other sort of instruments that can be leveraged? But we've also seen in the past the role that public-private partnerships have been put forward. Some recent gazettes and proposals that have been put forward around reducing the sort of the barriers that are associated with market actors that want to invest in specific projects, particularly those that are below 2 billion rand, and reducing sort of that red tape. And so those are some, I think, some of the non-financial ways in which can sort of mitigate some of those gaps. And of course, when it comes to the projections from the quarterly projection models or from a SAR perspective, I think that one continues to be one that would be important to watch quite closely post the 12th of March and really getting a sense as to what was ultimately arrived on. But of course, the international news flow that is influencing sentiment becomes quite important, because that will also inform what does the inflation outlook look like for the global economy, but also its impact on the South African economy. Appreciating the role that, for instance, the US and China play as our trade partners, our top two trading partners, both on the export side and on the import side, and any alterations in terms of tariffs or trade protectionism or a drive around, localized regional manufacturing, that has some impact in terms of what our outlook looks like from an inflation point of view. And ultimately, it goes back to our national bank account, our national revenue fund, and ultimately the resources that can be allocated there. So in my view, I think 2025 is an important year that will then set the tone across all of these areas so that we can then be able to really factor in these events in what 2026 and the medium term post that will look like.
Thanks for that. We've also got some more questions that are coming in. The first one I'm seeing talks about potential risks, opportunities from the delay for investors. Is there any risk or opportunity for an investor? If so, how would they position themselves?
Sure. I guess it also depends if you're an investor in terms of trading in, short run terms or you're long-term in the South African environment. From a long-term perspective, I think even some of the events that South Africa has gone through, there isn't necessarily, in my view, a fundamental or material risk that one needs to sort of be concerned about in the South African environment. In the short term, of course, peaks and troughs can be expected. And I think this is also a number of many firsts that we're likely to see, because we are indeed in a coalition government, a government of national unity. So I think that muscle needs to be priced in where South Africa is concerned when looking at investments in South Africa. So there's that balance that I think needs to be sort of investors need to take into account in the short run to expect those peaks and troughs, because it's a coalition government. But in the long term, I think the fundamentals when it comes to fiscal policy, monetary policy in South Africa has withstood the test of time. And I do expect that to hold even going into the future.
Yeah, and I think also just to add also for Molehadi that has asked the question, it's not advised to be trading on such short-term dynamics. This is a delay that's likely going to, play itself out in March already. So that's perhaps less than a month. There's no positioning really that you can have other than knowing beforehand if there are certain things that will be increased or decreased. So if we knew whether tax, whether the VAT was coming into effect or not, and how that would affect investors. Most of the time investors are concerned with where bond yields are going. So they're looking at borrowing requirements. They're assessing that kind of thing to say, okay, is Treasury able to decrease the debt we don't have a debt ceiling, but the level of debt that we've been accumulating, whether that's going up or down, we can't necessarily say that at this point, just given the delay, because the delay is really more administrative, if you would agree, Ndumiso, than it is something that is a strategic thing, because it's just a couple of days of something that is shocking to us, but it isn't unprecedented. So it's unlikely to be something that I think is tradable, really. And I think to your second question around the currency and the overall investment climate, what the postponement would affect, we had actually mentioned it earlier to say the currency has actually weakened on the back of that. But again, if there's insights that we garner in saying, actually, this may not be a bad thing, but it's actually, we're seeing the government of national unity playing out, like Ndumiso has pointed out, effectively, maybe investors might say, okay, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Let's wait for March and see what's happening. Because I think as we've been coming closer and closer towards the budget, we've actually seen a currency strength over the last couple of weeks. So I think, just to maybe answer that question, as well on your part. Ndumiso, there's a question around, Malema had suggested an increase in corporate tax and also this introduction of wealth tax. So the question is, do you think this can be a better substitute instead of a 2% increase in VAT? And how would that impact taxpayers if they were to decide to increase corporate tax or introduce wealth tax? I think just before you answer this, I don't know if I'm allowed to even mention this, but the speech is going around. It's making its rounds. So I'm hoping it's public knowledge, that the estimation around having this 2% VAT increase was bringing in north of 50 something billion rands, if I'm not mistaken. Please don't quote me on that number. So obviously 2% VAT throughout is a guaranteed amount, as opposed to having introduced something like a wealth tax on the wealthy, which already are a small percentage. Just want to add that before I hand it over to you, in terms of Gabit's question, to say, do we think that this is a better substitute of the 2% VAT? And I guess maybe your thoughts on the actual wealth tax and corporate tax that Malema was talking about.
I would wonder what your perspective is and the colleagues that have joined us. But my perspective when it comes to tax as it relates to revenue collection is, firstly, I'm interested in seeing what the newly developed 5-year sort of plan, I think the president called it now it's called the medium-term development plan, what it looks like, because it has assumptions there around what South Africa can do to achieve 3% growth. I'm mentioning this because when we're talking about different types of taxations, part of the limitations that we have when we frame the conversation in that way is because our economy is about 68% as a percentage of GDP driven by consumption. Now, these are levels that are similar to countries such as the US and other developed economies. You look at an economy such as China, which is classified as an emerging or a developing economy in broad terms. As a percentage of GDP, consumption is around 39%. And you look at the level of the growth rates that you're able to see with those kinds of intricacies. So for me, when we're having the tax structure conversation in South Africa, it raises important questions as to why does South Africa, when compared to a China, both developing economies as it were, this one 39% as a percentage of GDP consumption, South Africa at the levels of advanced economies. Even though it's at the level of advanced economies, South Africa has specific features that are a unique phenomenon. You don't necessarily find them anywhere else in the world. Elevated levels of inequality, elevated levels of unemployment, elevated levels of poverty. And so when we're talking about tax structures, the nuances would need to be reflected there. However, my point here is that an economic policy position or an economic policy plan needs to be the one that guides how we're going to be able to generate revenue, not only in the near term, but also in the midterm and going into the future. So when thinking only just from a near-term point of view, it then limits the possibilities that exist where South Africa's economic positioning in a changing world it then comes into play. So yes, there's tinkerings that we can do here and there on an annual basis. But I think that's the kind of discussion that we need to be having. How are we then positioning and structuring South Africa's not only fiscal ratios, but economic indicators in a way that are able to ensure that we have sustainability where our revenues are concerned, we're able to have sustainability in terms of economic growth, and also flattening unemployment and poverty. And so in answering, yes, it was a tax inquiry, but I think the guiding sort of framework that needs to be undertaken is one that has a conversation in that manner. Because in the absence of that, next year we'll have the same question. It might not be a wealth tax, or it would be a tax on all folks who have gone to university and are earning a particular income level, because now the upward social mobility has gone up, and so therefore we can afford to take a little bit more from Mandisa, for example. And so that becomes a conversation that becomes limited as opposed to the opportunities that exist for South Africa's economic positioning.
Sure. What a good response. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I'm biased. I'm the moderator. I shouldn't say that. I think on that, actually, there's a question here from Bongekile, and she's asking if there is any probability of having a fair budget that isn't actually going to worsen the situation for middle income class people, as well as poor group. I know people will talk about a zero budget, and the minister did comment on that to say that's a more theoretical construct as opposed to it being, practical. What are your thoughts on, do we have, maybe let me add that with Lumka's comment. She does pose a question, but her comment says maybe the timing and implementation was miscalculated, but taxes do need to increase to fund the fiscal deficits. So you see material changes to the budget on the 12th of March. And essentially both those questions, I think one saying, look, are we going to have changes in this going forward? And I think we've touched a little bit on that. But the question that I guess Boengile is interested in is, is there such a thing as the middle sweet spot where no one has trade-offs? And yeah, I'm reminded of that comment in economics to say there are no, there's always going to be trade-offs in economics. Like you can't, one person has to benefit while the other one loses. But your take, on that, maybe there's something no one has figured out that you can help us with in terms of how to make this budget even better. And yeah, adding that to Lumka's comment and question as well.
Yeah, sure. I think that's why we're having this conversation. It's a tough one because of the trade-offs, and perhaps that's why a DG gets paid the big bucks, and of course the Minister of Finance is there as well. Because the question of fairness across various segments of our population group is not only can be subjective but also relative as well. And so that's why the balancing act and the trade-off that you made mention of becomes quite important in considering the extent to which that can take place. So it becomes, I think, quite relative. In terms of tax increases broadly, we should anticipate that, because even when you look at previous budgets, generally in terms of consolidated expenditure growth patterns, we've seen a plus 4% growth in expenditure trends, which has been as a result of specific tax increases that we've seen across the board. So we've seen instances where tax increases have taken place at the level of sin taxes and so forth, but we've also seen tax increases that have taken place without adjusting the tax brackets for inflation. And so we've seen that. And so sometimes when no more South Africans then ask themselves, perhaps I hear good things that are happening about South Africa, but I'm feeling poorer. I'm not feeling, and sometimes it's because of those adjustments that were not necessarily made in terms of the tax bracket. So those kind of instruments we can expect in the budget that hopefully will certainly be delivered on the 12th of March. So those are some of the standard sort of tools that the finance ministry typically makes use of in very tight conditions, such as the ones we're faced with now.
I am aware that we are out of time. We were actually meant to keep this a 20-minute chat, but we do see quite a lot of questions coming through. So I will request that you please keep your questions for the 12th of March. We will still be having the webinar, but I think for now we can sort of cut it off. And I just want to take Don's question as the last one, and I do apologize to everyone else. Kagiso, please do keep your question for that. So Don just says, he joined later on, and we may have touched on this, but he wants to know, in your opinion, with good global political instability, with global political instability, including Trump's recent unpredictability, does this budget postponement weaken economic governance or strengthen democratic debate? And I think with that, I'm happy for you to sort of answer that and just leave us also with just some your last thoughts, and we can sort of move it over to Tule.
Sure, sure. Thank you so much, Mandisa, for that. I think perhaps looking at South Africa's track record, such a delay in terms of the announcement, my perspective is that there is no fundamental weakening of economic governance. I actually view it as an elevation of the discourse around economic policy choices there. And so I think that's where the opportunity lies. If you're mentioning the questions around the current US presidency as it relates to South Africa and so forth, South Africa is somewhat, from a foreign policy point of view, has tended to tread along a centrist type of perspective and not necessarily choosing extreme sides. And this, when we look at some of the data points that were shared by the IMF, I think in their 2023 or 2024 outlook, 2024, they shared an interesting chart around the extent to which countries that take specific positions on matters and the extent to which they can be adversely affected from a trade volatility point of view. And what was found is that typically countries that have a centrist or a central type of view where international relations or foreign policy is concerned tend to be moderately affected by trade volatility. And I think that's the positioning that South Africa has taken. And so in relation to your question around does it weaken or strengthen governance broadly, knowing South Africa, I don't think it does. But I might be biased, Don.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for your time, Dumiso. It was such such abrupt changes, but you just managed to really just prepare well for us. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. I greatly appreciate the questions that have come through. I feel, well versed to take on tomorrow. I'm happy now. Thank you so much, Tule. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And just to echo your point, Mandisa, as you closed, to both of you, really a heartfelt thank you for one, keeping us positive, and secondly, for educating us, because pretty much like everybody else, the question in my mind was, is this a South African case, or actually, this is generally how GNUs work. And it's good to know that we're not an outlier. Even countries like the Netherlands, as you said, Germany, of course, whom we regard as developed in many senses, are also going through their own challenges. And also, just to underscore what the finance minister said in his briefing today, someone asked a question around, whether this is some form of embarrassment as we approach the hosting of the opening ceremony of the G20 next week. And he said, look, those people have their own problems. So indeed, it actually is, great to know that we are not in trouble, but we're also not out of the woods. So just pretty much like, fine dining. So today was just a starter. We're just appetizing. And of course, we would have loved to have an entire hour and a half to ourselves so that we could hear more around what Ndumiso had to say. But do join us because we do promise we have more on the 12th, hopefully, on the day the budget speech does get delivered. And again, please do join us for the MTVPS that is much later in the year. So with those words, I want to echo Ndumiso's words to say 2025 is an incredible year, or rather an important one, because it does look like there's going to be great discussions around many things, but more importantly around the future of this country. And I just would like to say thank you for joining us, and have yourselves a great evening. We cannot thank you enough for staying and having faith in us to deliver what we promised. So do help yourselves a great week, and enjoy what is left of your evening. Thank you very much.